Thank you guys so much for joining us today. My name is Jenna Harris. I'm the Artist Engagement Director for YoloArts, and I have the privilege of supporting this gallery, our bar gallery, as well as Gallery 625, which we have across town. So welcome both in person and to our people joining us online. So to get started, I'd like to go ahead and acknowledge the lands that we are on. This has been the home of the Patwin people for thousands of years. And today there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Dihi Band of Wintu Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintu Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintu Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship over this land for many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here on our traditional homes today. With that, I would love to go ahead and introduce our artists in the exhibition today. In this two-person exhibition, Tana Quincy Arcega and Michael Ryan create a spectacle of objects and images pulled from the endless deposits of residual materials resulting from our accelerated growth economy. Their visual commentary angles on the cultural mindset of mass production and waste, as well as the vast array of ritualistic systems and customs that produce them. Both artists share a visual language based in realism that journeys toward abstraction through mimicry, utilizing traditional art media and building materials to accomplish this end. With a fascination for textures, the artists bring to light the hidden materials that pervade our landscapes, from plastic packaging to fashion waste. And to add in a personal note, I really feel that textural quality coming through. I think every visitor I've talked to I've just been so expressed about this, is really showing like texture and see how you can explore and connect through recognizable materials. So Tana, her practice explores the immanent qualities of materials and processes. This body of work traverses sewing and extrusion painting using various media, including building materials and industrial textiles. Visual themes are self-referential to give value and attention to the innate qualities of the selected humble materials. Her unique history is interwoven with concepts of care, manifested by her reuse of relic textiles, garment patterns, and seemingly delicate found objects. Born in Nebraska, the artist grew up learning to sew and emulate patterns in her mother's fabric store, a material-based background that fuses with formal art training in figurative painting and sculpture. Welcome. We're glad you're here. And Michael Ryan's practice engages the expansive range of manufacturing byproducts and packaging, and how these vessels and cavities inform and transform our natural and architectural environments. Working with a mix of traditional media as well as architectural building materials, Ryan concocts compositions and forms contextualizing the spaces and environments we inhabit through the residue of ritual. Sculpted objects echo the historical artifacts fused with the excavation of geological surveying. Imagery challenges the scope of depth perception through a mixture of chalkboard and children's puppet books. Awesome. So I know I just kind of wrote formal introductions, but if both of you would mind introducing yourselves in your own words, as well as your artistic practice, and maybe a little bit about your artistic roots.
So yeah, and thank you guys for being here. So happy to have you. My background, can you hear me back there? Okay. Is in figurative painting. So I studied at an academy in New York, very, very classical, and then so leading in contemporary art scene at New York. Shortly after I graduated, I had been struggling with an illness throughout grad school. So it was kind of lazy, but I took a year off and got back in there. But right after I graduated, I was not able to use my arms to hold a paintbrush. It was kind of like a stress injury that was really bringing back into this illness I was struggling with, and which led me to force me force my hand to figure out other ways to make marks. And so I began doing a series of sculptures built on paper, where I was maybe pressing and folding and tearing. And then eventually, I miss painting so much that within about 2 years back, I started painting with my mouth. And that really, from there, it was just a snowball effect. And all of my art making practices really consumed by exploring experimental ways of making which now I pulled from an earlier time of learning, which was my mom teaching me to sew as a child. She's a garment maker and seamstress, and now I'm using that as a marketing tool as well as extrusions.
My name's Peter Martin, obviously. I am originally from Virginia. I studied painting and making at ACU, Virginia Commonwealth University. And from there, that was so long ago. I went from there. I kind of had a nice break with schooling. I just really focused on music and kind of sound for a really long time. And found my way back to painting and drawing through post-graduation, really, with my master's at San Francisco State University, Charlotte, California. And that really, was just an interesting journey of kind of working through collaborative efforts of making music with bands and then kind of exploring sound and experimental ways through my own kind of means for a number of years that led me to my master's program in an interdisciplinary study at San Francisco State. And that post-graduation, I really, after that degree, I really found myself wanting to find kind of new materials to work with. And so I found myself kind of scavenging the streets for these kind of recycled materials that I became interested in working. And that really kind of just led me to the work you see now. I've been experimenting with that material for a really long time, just through sculpture and then through even some through sound. But then I found my way back through the pictorial arts, just two dimensions and work with the painting and drawing with it. But I, again, kind of keep weaving in and out of structural forms as much as working with images, materials. So,
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So, touching on your practice and your roots, and then moving into this body of work that we have here. I would love to hear more about how you see your role as an artist. In your notes of the exhibition, you both mentioned responsibility to portray the overlooked. Can you share more about that idea and maybe how it manifests itself here?
Yeah, I think, the title Residue of Ritual, we're both thinking about the leftover, the remnants, the spaces of all of the mass manufacturing output that is, we're left with after accelerating overproduction, things we don't really need. And then I think as an artist, you want to draw from those things that are not only in the overflow, but also in the overlooked, right?
That's a good way to think about not just the overflow, but the overload. Because I think even though that there's, for me, a lot of the materials that I'm working with and that I conceive in threading with our work is this, not just the materials themselves, but the routines of the everyday that we do going on in our lives. And they're all exercised through material, objects or material, both, materials that make objects. And there's this navigating our everyday through these moments. There's so much of it that I feel like is kind of, it cycles back through this process of production and consumption. And I think through our own routines, we can kind of overlook those habits and the things that we're handling, so to speak, as a tool to this other means. But for myself, I'm just always very curious looking at these things and just thinking about them. I mean, I think half of the work in the way that I work is a matter of reflection and just meditation upon these forms, witnessing what they are without necessarily trying to orchestrate them into some other narrative that expands upon it. So it's this kind of way of just really focusing on those still thoughts and really trying to link back. Because there's such a really strange, I think both of us deal with abstraction as much as we look at the reality of these forms. And there's such a weird blurred line between that, the abstraction that they make of our lives, or how we treat them very abstractly. But there is such a connection that I think it's just really important to think about how they're connected to systems.
I definitely, in my practice, I've used a lot of items that are specifically not meant to be noticed or seen. So drawer liner is one of them, spackle paste with filler with glue, a lot of really functional materials that were not made to have a sense of presence or being to blend in. And I somehow feel, I find a lot of pleasure in making those the center of attention. And I think it also correlates to the subject matter of some of my themes. Specifically, I did a body of work about the unhoused and thinking about the work that Patrice did with them and her kind of humility in relationship to the textile towels. So we think of towels as sort of going back as a usable, functional thing. Your house does a lot of funky things. It scrubs floors, it wipes bodies, and her work also reflected that from essence where she would do the smallest things, like give her umbrella to a policeman that didn't have one, so bigger things, saving lives and nursing the sick on the street. So there's always this sort of multi-faceted connection to that sense of, whether it's maintenance work, which is considered a more, sweeping the floors, it's a humble, kind of overlooked process, not glorified, right? To the object does those things, to the spackle paste that fills a meal with this gathering so that it becomes invisible, it's reset, meant not to be seen. Somehow I'm really drawn to that and really feel it's my calling, or just, I don't know, whatever it is, the artist motivates the artist to do something or to work with in a realm. I need to give a voice or give purpose or presence even to material in a way that is sort of transcendent.
I think in both of your practices, and based on what you're saying now, between objects that are everyday objects or objects that are not glorified, but maybe labor-based and very essential to our functioning. Where are you sourcing materials, right? I think there's an expectation that work like this is, for lack of a better term, like dumpster art, right? Like what you see, you're not necessarily expecting this elevated high concept art that is produced out of it, right? So how do you go from those unglorified materials into something like this that feels very elevated, very hyper, you know, and encouraging the viewers to take that moment for deeper consideration?
For myself, when I'm thinking about the materials, when I started doing this, it was all out of this one sculpture that I had this idea for, and it's a matter of having to get access to a lot of watermarks. There's the obvious route is the people's recycling. So I would go through my neighborhood at the time was Potrero Hill, and I would kind of scavenge. And I think when you're out having to gather materials that way, you all of a sudden see all the connections that it draws into. I mean, not only did I find myself fantasizing about being this forensic, officer, looking through someone's trash. And what does this go to? So, you have this, all of a sudden I was like realizing that there was this whole community of people that relied on this as a currency to get food and shelter. There was so many people scavenging for recycling and this or that. Maybe not armies, but they're just that resourceful that they could, access that as a form of currency. But regardless, there was a certain level of recognizing the need between those different classes of people, putting it out there, and then people that were collecting them. And I felt myself in this really middle ground, this level of observation where I was privileged enough to be within the community to look at this in a certain way. And that, I think, is really that all about this, is this level of privilege that you are being able to access this material in this philosophical way rather than a need. But also identifying with that understanding what that need is. And then it's hard not to look at the materials that make up these materials that are mass produced. It's such crazy volumes. Are really our most precious resources are part of those things that are making up these materials that are just kind of thrown into these bins. And the idea of recycling is, I think, a beautiful concept, but I think we've started to peel back that onion a little bit and recognize that there's a lot of complexities within that. It's nothing to kind of scoff at, but it is something that I think that still makes me go like, that's still a viable reason to be kind of making this work and talking about these issues. That's the one aspect of the point that I can think about in gathering those materials. Now these materials come to my house, it's just like being a father, whether or not I want to buy these products that have all this packaging, that doesn't mean I'm not going to receive it. There's all kinds, my daughter gets all kinds of gifts from all over. And so many things that I might need come in this certain type of packaging. And I think after a while, it just became, it didn't matter that it was plastic anymore. It was just a matter of how packaging kind of makes everything nice and neat for us. And if it's the more recyclable it is, the more we don't have to kind of face these terms of our dependency on this materiality and how we're using it. So yeah, it's just my sourcing for those materials now is just this it's so abundant that it's not necessarily, it's just a matter of seeing its potential. And I think that is what a lot of artists these days are starting to recognize, the potential of the discarded or found objects. And yours is a very different material, so yeah, I think we have it.
Yeah, well, I work, of course, with a lot of fabrics, a lot of textiles, some history. And a recent body of work was focusing on the garment industry specifically. So I have been getting materials from outlet fabric stores that received them from the LA fashion district, the design district. So they're all sort of, it's called dead stock, where the company produces a bunch of products and then they discontinue it. They have this leftover fabric and it gets shipped up north and sold at stock outlets. I, in addition to going there to source it, would often be drawn to the remnants of remnants. So people would buy a certain amount and there was only a couple years left and fold it out and put it in the remnant. And I was especially drawn to those, and I did feel a significance in that. I really wanted to work with these things that were the offshoots of the leftovers.
So kind of following along this theme of materials, but maybe moving more into the idea or the themes and the subject matter of your work. How do you give your voice to your work dramatically? And in using these materials, how are you creating an antidote or a disruption to the ritualistic system of capitalism?
Yeah, both.
Well,
Definitely, the material does become the concept of the work. The work is about the material. We were thinking of like our ritual. It's very slow in the studio. We bring things way down, still to this. I know it's very not about producing a product. It's more about the poetics of creation and the philosophy behind it.
yeah, I feel in league with that too. So, just that idea of, taking these objects of mass production, and what I focus on are usually byproducts. They're mass produced at the byproducts, so they don't really have a purpose past selling them to someone or transporting it, or protecting it in that way. But I think by just focusing on it as a subject, as a point of reference, like you talked about heightening it to this level of a different, I think that's already anti-capitalist already in that notion. The fact of also, for myself personally, became important to kind of translate or think about this material through a personal touch. I think that tactility, that the fact that different objects go through different people's hands and until it finally comes to you, is a really interesting thought about these objects and how they fit into our economic growth system, but also how they fit into our lives personally. And that's something that I always think about because, we're thinking about the critique of a capitalist society and we're talking about the critique of mass-produced items. There's a number of mass-produced items that I hold very dear to me, records that I love, so many different objects. But I do think by making an individual work of art that is unique to itself is already this kind of exercise of anti-capitalism that can come into play. But I also think it's very important that we talk about it. And so I think by, for myself, as I approached the drawings of them, these paintings, mixed media images, it's hard for me not to think back to still life, other, still life paintings and what they kind of tracked at the time, chronologically, the different market systems that were kind of going into place. And for me, I think this is really important to kind of do more of these types of works to focus on and to let us become aware of it's not what you're buying, it's not what they're selling, it's what you're buying, right? I think that's a really important notion. But it is an object that goes into a market as well. So there's this really interesting double edge to that story.
And I think the idea of a kind of meditative process comes in where, we live in a kind of spirituality, which is anti-natural. The object becomes a source of meditation. So we're thinking about presence and the unseen, the value of the material as maybe like the Native Americans, a living sensibility. The river is a person. So it's sort of bringing back that sensibility of value back into the material itself through the act, the meditative process of just sitting with that material and illuminating its presence.
So what I'm hearing is for both of you, the intentionality, the selection of those materials, you're really utilizing your artistic skill and just looking, right? Really looking, connecting with the object, and it's kind of level of function and existence in our society. And then by taking that and placing a value judgment, you're kind of flipping that on its head, right? You're looking for these invisible, undervalued objects that are meant for a purpose, but not necessarily a consumable purpose, and giving them new life. Would you say that sounds accurate?
And illuminating their name value, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I always think about just kind of giving it a second touch, so to speak. And making its production on the concept of these packages that I always recognize are, there's obviously teams of people trying to develop these, and it's something that I think, I don't know, it's something to reflect upon that I think has the potential to grow into something a lot larger. But it just needs attention. But it's also just I know it's my own obsession of certain things, and so I feel, I said a long time ago, I could see myself doing this forever. These forms and these things are just really interesting to me, and it does provide a certain type of practice for myself of just looking. And I think that was something in other materials and media that I've worked with in the past. There was a lot of troubleshooting going on, and there's still always troubleshooting, especially when you're trying to unify different disparate materials. Sometimes you're thinking about that, but there is this level of meditation, I feel like, in my practice now that is just about sitting with something and really spending time with it, looking at it. And with the painting, I think anybody working in any kind of media, your own object does it as well. As you're developing it, there's this time where you just have to sit with it and look at it, and just let it be, and looking for these things that it's communicating to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to reiterate, I think this picture of the mass production, things flying off conveyor belts and just being repeatedly, like, systematically spit out. And we take that fast pace and those materials and we slow it way down. So it's very much the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, taking that idea of, the skill of looking, right? It's definitely a developed skill, visual literacy, things like that. So as I move around this gallery and I'm taking in the works, right? Of course, we've been talking a lot about materials, right? That's something that really, really stands out. To use so many various types of fabric, right? So we have, for example, the terry cloth beach towel that looks like a map, almost a topographical map that you've created from there, or over here, this fabric, arranged with mesh shorts, right? And there's a sense of movement and activeness from that between the airflow and the breathability of the fabric. And several of your paint prints that you've created, and paint is probably not the right word, you can correct the materials there. But to me, all those look like made fabric, right? And like to be getting closer to the materials and really kind of seeping and long observations to connect with your work in that manner, to really kind of see the ideas that you were pulling together more clearly. So can you share more with us about your process of selection and how you ultimately decide what's created out of those? And what experience do you want to create for viewers they can let person?
Yeah. Well, I am really, I think it's my representation painting background. I just always so much pleasure in painting what I saw and trying to replicate it. And so when I transitioned through my mark making exploration, I kind of was forced also to transition into abstraction. And in a way, it was organic and intuitive, but I was training myself to do that by taking all these photos of like marks or cracks on the sidewalk, blotches of paint, and things that were, again, like overlooked, process of time, marks made by whatever effect. And I really instilled that into my consciousness, taking all those iPhone photos when I moved to San Francisco and categorizing them. And then they necessarily drawn to that. And I think it was my way of looking at the world on a different scale and finding that I could do representational work, aka abstraction, by creating work about these very different kinds of marks. And so a lot of my mark making is just that, where I'm speaking back to the substrate or the surface, like you mentioned the tallow piece, the yellow and white one over there. I wanted to replicate through the extrusion process, which is the big shape in the middle that's all extruded, and I used wood filler and spackling these because the mixture is the same yellow that's in the fabric, so it's really bringing me back to those roots of representationalism. And I wanted to kind of fool the eye or mimic what I saw to give the viewer pause and just to create a sense of interest. Like, what am I looking at? I wanted someone to stand in front of the painting and basically just not be able to figure it out. Have to have that slow read, rather. So I think that's really fun for me to play in that way. And it's a way of interacting with my materials as an abstract painter in a sort of roundabout representation form.
Thanks for sharing. Michael, I'd like to ask you more specifically about your painted pieces, or your sculpture, and of course, pull in where you would like to. You use a lot of bold colors and dramatic shadows, and layers of everyday or recognizable objects in a way that mimics or evokes to me a sense of stillness or almost mundane moments of everyday life. And for some of these compositions, for me, I get a really strong sense of nostalgia just from the objects that are kind of portrayed. So can you tell us a bit more about your process of creation and what inspires you? And if you have a particular approach you take when developing your compositions? I know you mentioned kind of a still life approach earlier, but
Yeah, I think that's just how they become framed in that regard. I mean, it's funny because, this process of where I'm at now, and you refer to them, I love that there is this tendency to talk about Tana's work in the sense of painting as well as these panels. And I can see them as paintings at the same time. Most of the marks are drawn. There's no real brush involved, but it's mixed media. And it's this side, I again come back to that interesting point of tactility and texture that we brought up, because there is this level of texture, I think, to all of both works, but there's this denial of being able to touch it, right? To really understand what that material is. So I think that's something we're both interested in, is this curiosity of what it is that you're looking at or maybe. As far as these specific panels, they really reference the process of the work with these materials in the past. I would really devise this very strategic way of photographing them to kind of put them in a very virtual kind of space. And then through this means, I eventually would be like looking around in the process and see the piles of packaging that I would have laying around my house or apartment. And I started paying attention to those interactions that they were having with the domestic spaces or the studio space that I was in. And then also the other thing is I was thinking a lot in the past, I was working with controlled lighting, as you would with advertising and creating a certain type of capturing something, it's certain properties, but all of these were all pretty much sunlit. So it was about natural light, and I was kind of really touching upon things in painting that I think about with painting a lot, and this idea of natural lighting. And so again, these strong shadows that emerge from this. And it really was about these spaces being within my domestic space. And as I was developing these sculptures at the same time, starting to really play into that understanding of familiarity and non-familiarity, with this idea of representation and being true to a certain representation or letting it become more abstract and ambiguous. And so I think with the process involved me starting to recognize the shape of the sculptures and how much I really enjoyed this, and I really wanted this to become a part of the pictorial aspect. And I think you're just going through life and you see all of these things come at you. And so I think being a father of a young child and being around like pop-up books, there was this really interesting thing that I was noticing about pop-up books and where it's all representation, and it's this idea to kind of engage three-dimensional space in a way that leads to experiencing objects and life. But there's this certain sense of prop to it that I think is really interesting that I really wanted to address. So yeah, there's this level of design where I would find images that I had. Some of them would be more arranged. Some of them would just be like, I just realized my objects were laying in a certain way in a specific space. And I would take a photo of that and then really kind of design how I was going to create the shape and how things were going to overlap. But again, you're working with mixed materials, I had to have a strategy about stuff, especially if it's oil-based versus water-based. Was thinking about those things. But there was always a challenge. There was always a little bit of troubleshooting that, like I talked about in the past, but it was this type of troubleshooting that I was really interested in. Of how to make these work become a little bit more dimensional. But I also really wanted to address the flats because this, I really wanted to think about this idea of the image and these things becoming an image, and the idea of image as an object, as something consumed, because I think that is something, a really interesting place that we're in our civilization right now is the consumption of imagery, and how that somehow generates revenue. I mean, I understand in the world of art markets, but in the realm of technology and the internet and social media, I still is this really fair to me. I don't really quite comprehend it. So I was really interested in that idea of participating in that image realm, but offering something else.
No, I really like the connection you made. I have small children myself, and this work, for example, right in front of me that I've been staring at during this whole third time speaking, and I am picturing my daughters 2 days ago, taking packing materials and using them as blocks, and then they were building robots out of that, and then right that kind of cycle of creative play, and it keeps going and going and going. And you mentioned that kind of pop-up boat, tomboy aesthetic to your work. And in terms of everyday objects or everyday kind of engaging with both the artwork as a higher form, but also the everyday aspect of the objects. My art historian brain really goes back to like ancient fresco making, right? And like the frescoes of Pompeii or Herculaneum that people were putting in their homes, right? This idea that, of course, it was more of an upper class practice as it is now. But the idea that kind of living with your everyday objects or living with your everyday views in your house, but on an elevated level, right? I just really feel that connection. But I think that's before, so thank you. All right, we've been chatting for quite a bit, so I'd like to open it up to our audience with any questions. We did pass out some note cards earlier, so you can pass them to the front. I'm happy to ask, or feel free to ask your own questions. And if anybody's with us in the virtual world, I'm happy to forward any questions from there.
Are you afraid you won't be able to do
They're mostly went through so many different interesting points and subjects that oddly fit really well together. I guess I have many questions actually, but can I ask?
Yeah, go for it.
I know you didn't talk about this. You mentioned that you're a musician, but I know Tana is also, and almost majoring in music. So you're both deeply concerned about music, and I wonder if any of that is in your current practice of these paintings, and if so, can you share?
Such a good question. I think that as we were kind of like meshing up ideas for this talk, I think the thought of visual noise and texture and sound, there's a lot of overlaps and correlations that somehow like our musician brains are operating in here. I'm not sure if I fully understand it. I personally haven't made a very specific, distinct connection to my visual art to my music, and it's a future goal of mine. I feel like that's coming. Even have an ecology residency proposal sitting by the piano, make work that write songs that go with my work. I don't know how that would happen, but so we put them up, and the thing that comes to mind now is just texture, visual texture.
Yeah.
Sense.
No, I think so. I mean, it's hard. There's so much written about color, sound, texture, and oral textures, qualities. And you can kind of relate those things. I mean, for myself personally, like the work I don't relate the two to the music that I make as much, other than the fact that often this material came to me through, experimental ways, and working with sounds. I was really excited about material making sounds, especially styrofoam. I've sampled so many weird sounds. Plastic as well, created weird little instruments that came from plastic and those acoustics. And so I definitely would say that, but I think for me, when I'm working with this, there is this, sometimes I love just working in silence. And there's this, just the process itself is something that is enough for me, normally, to kind of hear what's going on. But yeah, I don't actually have a connection, I think, with the sound stuff that I've done in the past, other than, like I might relate a composition I did on different musical composition I did to a painting or something, and getting off certain feeling. I do think that, I find myself, whenever I'm interested in finding instruments to make sounds or make music, it's usually, I'm really interested in the playfulness, something that takes a stab at the intellectual kind of goodness of stuff. I think that sense of humor is really fun. And so I kind of feel like I do that with my color palette. I think in the past I used to be very academic about my color palette. And now I find much of my color palette can be limited to just maybe the materials I'm working with around. Like, this is what this paper comes in, and I want to work with this colored paper, so I'm going to see how I make this work.
Yeah. I want to say too that I'm remembering now. It feels like kind of far removed in this work now, but when I transitioned from representational painting into abstraction, it was the soundtrack that I was listening to that really informed. So I was listening to a lot of minimalist music and thinking about the sort of sound waves and the the hand clapping. This is even well, right?
Oh, Stephen Wright.
Stephen
Steve Wright.
Okay. So anyway, a lot of that really fed into the work, and it gave me some kind of visual presentation of what I was making. Again, I haven't really researched that in my process that well yet, so I'm not able to articulate it that well, but I know that it fed into the kind of visual things that were happening as far as texture, visuals, or something very much akin to music.
I have some questions too. So many things. You mentioned talking so deep, like we've been thinking about one of the things, many questions that come up with me is this idea of like the daily overlooked materials or the plastic binders, sort of this humble, almost trash, and your skill of transforming it into really beautiful objects. So it's just a pleasure to look at all of these things, and especially for me to see the conversations that you're having with each other. So and the like harmony of color palettes that's happening. I don't like is that related to that? Is there a humbleness to the palette? Like there's just these amazing, like when you were laying this out, can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
That's so fun.
And what was being revealed? Because I feel like there's always whispering to come.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like we were just dancing. So when we were like, okay, what about this? And like there was this kind of lead, and it was very easy to kind of, I mean, there were certain decisions that were hard not because it was because, oh, well, that could also go with this. Like there was this, we saw, so many different dialogues that could happen. So there was just kind of whittling that down, and I think that was what was really exciting, just realizing we had so many options to kind of play with. Um, and, this is really comes from you, which is a great person that this comes from, because, this all kind of came about from a conversation we had with you at Birdhouse Gallery. And honestly, we should talk about showing it.
And then just seeing Tara's work, and you see your work, it's so resonant, it's so fun to see it, each other this way.
And I think we had conversations prior to that about like potential showing and stuff. And then so that like solidified this like we should figure this out. We should try to propose something that puts the two works together. So yeah, that was like a cool little thing. But I think it was great that it went just beyond just the two people, and there's other people that kind of pick up on.
And so to reference your specific question, you're curious about how we see the works intertwining. I mean, it's so funny because we realized, not only do the works, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of overlaps, so many different overlaps. I think Mike is representing a visual texture, where I'm using one actual texture, and so they're sort of speaking back and forth to each other. The materials like this, what is that packaging that's sort of like the composite cardboard? I actually have a piece just that on a piece of gray paper. That's just like the match perfectly, and I was really all stoked about that when I was first starting to explore materials, because I would just do pairings. And then, oh, this works with this. I'm just going to make it on the wall. And so it was so nice to see that in your work. And just so many similar ways of thinking about the creative process and what we're trying to see with live and create.
But just enough difference
Yeah.
that makes it have an exchange, I think, without just an echo.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that, there's this high sense of representation, and you talk about Trump within my work, that like this idea of illusionism. And yours is, you are really emphasizing that point. But there's this other level of representation that emerges from that, right? That I think comes back to talking about the material representing itself. But the illusion of paint, right, with that, right? You talked about how the caulk and those materials, it's hard not to reference these as paintings. And so there's this really, I mean, I always think that's really interesting when you can't figure out how to name a work. That's like trying to describe a band to somebody that you really like, and you're just going to use a bunch of other bands to do it, which is this kind of shorthanded way to talk about it, but it works, right? It's a way to kind of communicate that. And I think with that divide, there's this, we're both really paying attention to that surface a lot. And sometimes, yours takes on for myself, like you talked about with Matt. I see this really interesting dialogue within his work of macro to micro. This idea that I'm looking in a petri dish, or I'm up in a plane looking at, and that parallel between those two senses of observation. That you're looking down on something and looking into it. I really loved those differences. And then I think shape for myself, it's just like when I see this echo of shape and the way that we think about it, part of me is like, that's not just us, it's just this like oversaturated modernism that's happening in our lives, that we all, everything is kind of has this unique shape or quality to it. So I think that was, we both emphasized those things quite a bit. So I felt like that was part of that piece of that. I think part of it, like when we were writing, was like, how do we whittle this down into a digestible paragraph, instead of like meandering throughout everything. But that's what the talk show is.
Why? It should be like multi-series mini novels.
I like that your answer to the question about how the works interplay, because I feel like it touches back on your question about the musicality of the work, right? And how that interplay kind of comes together with both of you having a music background. And I just had started having the sense you were talking about frequencies, and I was like, that's it. You guys are just operating on the same frequency, right? You're approaching it in your own ways, with your own style, but that frequency, that connection of you're putting a band comes together for an informal jam, right? You guys are working with that same intention, that same goal, and it just kind of all comes together, right? The rhythm or the back and forth.
You described it as a dance. Either like, and I feel like the abstract elements are kind of like evidence of these processes that you talk about.
I was thinking about the musicality and the trust and just improvisation, right? Just like, there's this trust and just going for it, and just pursuing, and it could be visual or musical, or it's happening mentally, where you're combining things. There's just like a place where you're just certain comfort level, just trusting problems where it's. So I don't really have questions, I just have observations.
Eliminates another way that our processes are similar that I didn't realize when you mentioned that, the trust here, you're just seeing how objects interact with space and how they happen to be relating. That's where most of my compositions come.
Just from happenstance, like
Like Messy Studio, this material goes with this, and then I even like this random scrap, I use the cutouts of my other intentional drawing patterns and the shapes that are left over, and they'll make, that's where all of the smaller pieces, the square, anything that's square, like that will sort of the leftover of the leftover. But yeah, we have that in as well.
totally, yeah. I mean, sometimes I have like this, like I'm like, okay, that's good, but I'm gonna just go with my feeling of pushing this a little closer here, and then I'll like realize that okay, that's what I want. So there is this like agency that I don't let it be completely, but either you on it, right? Like there's this decision that this is enough, that this is here, and I do, yeah. It's funny when you talk about like a band coming together for a jam. I almost thought of it as two DJs because we have sample ones, like we're working from things that are already its own form and they have their own representation, but we're trying to like kind of mix them together to kind of create a new composition and your meaning, I think. Yeah.
Any final observations?
First of all, I appreciate you both sharing your collaborating with your approach to art and how you create this kind of dimension of how I perceive it and how I see it feel like this open setup for me more so, and I like to hear you more about it. But for both, and I know Mike started a little more about renewing, but what's next for both of you in the form of continuing to expand on what you're doing right now, or what's exhibited here, versus are you moving somewhere completely different? Or
Yeah.
I know Tana, you mentioned maybe something with music.
Yeah, that's one idea. But thank you. It's such a great question. So we want to talk about this next.
I want to see more of both, basically. That's what it comes
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, a few things.
So I did a residency this summer at Winslow House in Vallejo. So I just passed it on the way up, and I wanted to explore basically something to do with trees. My proposal was greenscapes and being inspired by the Pacific Northwest. I currently teach at a forest preschool, so we're in the trenches of redwood forest in Golden Gate Farm with little kids, but I'm almost like observing the lichen and then of course trees and all of these overlapping forms of beautiful unique colors that just really permeate my senses. And so I knew I wanted to go with that during my 3-week stay at the Winslow House. But what I didn't realize was that I was going to be making these sort of like network drawings that are now they're representing. It's very representational, but it again displays as abstraction because I'm drawing very specifically the angles and lines of the spaces between the branches, and thinking that's plunging me into this super like delicious, wonderful thought project of how the species communicate with each other and how forests are so integrated, which I think has a lot to teach us in the future. It continues a thread of my work being about, maybe eliminating hidden workers, you could say, but it also is about listening and having kind of humility to sort of come to the table and just be a listener. And I feel like right now we really need to hear from the ecosystems outside ourselves, outside of the human population, noticing, which is really fascinating because as I was doing this work, it was in June of this summer. I called my friend in Massachusetts. We went to grad school together, figurative painting background. She was putting together a show, curating it, and I'm like, "Oh, what's the show about?" And she described what I was working with. She's like, "I've been talking to all these artists on the East Coast, and they're all making work like this." And so it's really permeating our somehow collective psyche, which I think is super exciting. So yeah.
That's awesome. That's for Mike. I'm gonna let you go.
I'm not. You know,
I also like to mind between sculpture and painting. Like, you kind of something between.
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel like that's an exhaustive thing. I mean, for myself, I think the concept of image as object, sculptural form goes into this image consumption idea of thinking about things. But I'm right now, my idea is really of just in pursuing. I still am thinking about these containers and domestic spaces and my other spaces. I feel like that's something I'll continue. But I've been focusing. You're always storing stuff. When you have art and I'm storing the storage. I really ends up doing them around packaging these packages to keep them preserved or use them again later or whatever. And I found that these were really interesting compositions. It was kind of like what you come about with. These are laid out already, and so I would kind of become witness to these environments, or these packages becoming their own environments. And so I've been thinking about this idea of nesting in several different terminologies, but in the world of capitalism, this idea of nesting one desired product and the other desired product, and just keeping that going. Apple has been genius at this, right? Of like being able to have a product that the power supply is going to have a different gap next time around, and you're not going to be able to switch that out so easily without having to spend a bunch of money. So there's this kind of trick that's kind of happening within that. But I think it's part of a natural process that we just do. So it's something that I became interested in, was this idea of the packages inside of the packages and creating compositions out of this. So part of me, I'm like, maybe this is just for my own, but it's like, okay, I'm okay with that if that's the case. It's just another thing for me to kind of explore as far as compositions. And so, yeah, I'm finding my way back into oil painting. But as I do that, I'll spend, it's like anything else, I'll start to miss some of the other materials that I'm working with. So it's just kind of going from one thing to the next, and just feeling the connections between them as I go. But no big major plans other than exploring them well over this road.
Yes. Thanks for your generosity in this talk today. And also sharing favorite stuff. I just feel like this conversation is great. It's why I have all these little so like concepts in the back. When we talk about sort of highlighting things in spaces or places, but if there's an aspect in both of the works and like the space between the space. So I feel like there seems to be like a reverse effort in a lot of the works, like the extrusion works. Like I see the front of the work and I think about what's happening with the back.
Yeah.
And I think of like processes of pressure and resistance and also reversal. And then within Michael's like sculptural work and so the wall works, a reverse process of like casting within found objects, right? So then I'm looking at the work in the show and I'm hearing you talk, and I'm almost like these are two very different artists working in very different ways, and yet there's this aspect of this space within between the works that's very interesting to me as well. And then I look at the ground and I see this like mark on the ground, where it makes me think of the alternative space and space around the space in this other way. And so my question is just if maybe individually you could talk about like sort of like the relationship of cartography to your practice, it's mapping. Because I feel like it's two different things, but it's very much like when you talk about the collection aspect of earlier works and like it's very much like that as a kind of mapping. There's like an index of quality in both of these works that I feel like exist outside of anything that they feel like they move on with the conversation. So maybe that's an interesting.
Great. That's a great question.
Yeah, it's the one I'm like still kind of chewing on right now as I'm thinking about it.
Well, you mentioned the macro micro aspects of my work. I definitely, again, this was in the transition. We're moving from representational to abstraction. There's a lot of things that were moving around in my brain, and one of the distinct things that I remember visually, I was really drawn to, in addition to the marks, random marks on the sidewalk, was the overhead view from the plane, and just like massively beautiful the layout of the landscape and the kind of like soft edge to hard edge, the soft pattern of the forms where the mountain, would cascade out to the forest of very soft edge versus the mechanically created lines of fields. But just beautiful shapes and like totally like color scheme and just the grass and trees and so and then I didn't realize this, but until people started bringing it to my attention, because I in the again back to the Mother Teresa body of work, yellow and white piece. Everybody, so many people wondered if they were counties or states. They're actually imagined interior spaces for that house. So I was thinking like architecture. So I think there's a rendering of that planar view as we cartography. So
I love with your sense of macro, because even micro looking at the map of the Northeast and kind of dissecting it down. As far as my own work, I think just the idea of focusing on shape so much, it makes you look at that you now put yourself from this observational standpoint to look at something. And you know, I could draw to certain literal things that like part of all of this, you know, these panels that are in here that I worked on have to do with moving, me moving from one space to another very quick, like that very short notice, and becoming kind of coming into new spaces. So there was this kind of movement of objects, transporting them and stuff in this sense, you know, literal sense of mapping, but the reference of like how they're represented. I think this, you know, again, this maps are really interesting in that way that it's an image representing a space that we can't see, right? That we have to kind of use our imagination. So there is this kind of, you know, for myself, I'm playing on those, the sense of depth perception and how I look at stuff. But again, as far as there is this other sense of mapping that I'm talking about when it comes to mass production and tracking the tracking, you know, tracking the development, these different stages of development, mass production. Not necessarily going back to paper bags in this work, but you know, there is this really lucid material, plastic material versus more friendly paper products. And that's something that I really wanted to kind of get into was starting to expand into this idea of not just looking at these things that have so much debate of the materiality, but it still comes down to convenience. You know? So I do think that in some ways, really just kind of tracking people's, you know, where we are right now.
Kind of like I'm having
Yeah, yeah. That's probably the best thing.
conceptual.
But it's also just really personal. You know, I mean, I can't. It's never been. Again, when I first started, there was a certain level of critique, but I can't deny the fact that, like, in order to really fully critique it, you have to be immersed, right? And belong to it. And so, like, I think that was something that I always thought about in grad school. There was a lot of discussion of what culture do you belong to, or what is it that you're going to highlight from your culture, like amidst consumer culture. That's really what has been, if I was to really think about, you know, my heritage, I don't really have that in my family. That, you know, yeah, we celebrated St. Patrick's Day, but like it wasn't this, you know, fact. And so it made me think back and like, well, like what is the history of consumer culture? You know, and it is, you know, it was born on the heels of theology, you know, and Christianity, all these different types of belief systems that help to perpetuate it. And now that it's really confused in a regular state, which I think is even more reason to talk about. You know, still to this day, think about like the only way to successfully make change happen is through the pocket of those people that have that power. So again, it's not what you're selling, it's what you're buying, right? And that's the thing that I kind of keep thinking about. It's how are we participating in the multitude of problems or situations or social issues that are going on in the world? It's through our blind obedience of consumption. And it's so autonomous, you know, it's they've redefined need. And that has become, since that has been transformed, it's been very easy for them to continue shipping along anyway to foreigners, you know. It's just kind of how the system works. But I do think it's like just becoming aware of it is going to become enough. We can keep heightening the awareness of that. That is the best act. So, yeah, I didn't really see, yeah, I kind of thought art as a way of countering that. I think the way that the both of you answered it, I feel like I see it as resistant to it, but very much within it, like an awareness on the specificity of the materials. Yeah, so creative response. Yeah.
I really like that in that answer, right? And we'll come back around to, again, these systems, their roots, and coming back to that idea of ritual, right? And how, however far back, he was kind of like that sense of not just sameness, right? The repetitive motion of a ritual, but that spiritual aspect, right? That spiritual connection, right? Between that want or that need, whether it's, you know, again, like a theological or spiritual connection, or, you know, kind of what where we're at now in our consumer culture is more of like the thing or the item that can fill that space. And, or that cannot fill that space.
We're still trying. Let's try to make it right. Here we go.
But I think that's just a beautiful way to kind of wrap us back around. I want to be mindful of our time. Thank you guys, everyone, so much for joining us and for participating, for your incredibly thoughtful and insightful questions. It's been a beautiful discussion. I'd like to thank both of you for working with YoloArts and bringing your work to YoloArts to our gallery. It's really just a joy to not only work with you guys, but also to chat with the community about your pieces as they come through the gallery. So thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much.